I hope everyone's had a great week. We're going to do something a little bit different now in our study of the Holy Spirit. We're going to walk through the Bible, beginning in Genesis all the way to Revelation, and look at the names that the Bible gives of the Holy Spirit. You know, the Holy Spirit's the hidden member of the Trinity. Far too many Christians live far below their potential because they've never discovered and really unwrapped that gift of the Spirit. We've known little or nothing about His power, His indwelling, His intercession, His gifts. And here's what I want us to know. God does not demand that we be able to explain the doctrine of the Holy Spirit in order to enjoy His blessings. You know, we've been so confused through the years trying to understand the doctrine and how the Spirit works. I think that we failed to just enjoy the gift that God gave us at baptism. And by studying the names of the Holy Spirit, I think we get an idea of how the Spirit worked in the different periods of Bible history. But this is for sure, His primary role throughout history has never changed. And that's to help God's people to be more like God. Now, you may be amazed, as I was at least, to discover how much the Old Testament says about the ministry of the Holy Spirit. You know, the Spirit's ministry is just absolutely essential, I think, to finding that consistent peace, joy, and victory as a Christian. And I just think because we know little or nothing about His power and the gifts and the fruits, that we're living just way below that potential. But living without understanding the role of the Holy Spirit, you know, is, I guess, an example of trying to drive a car that's empty on gas. And no wonder we don't go anywhere in our Christian walk. Remember STP, that gas additive? STP for the Christian, Spirit transforming power that we need. You know, mere enthusiasm often propels us out of the baptistry, but once we kind of reach a certain level, it seems like we get to the status quo, kind of where everyone else is around us, and we just seem to stop in our growth as Christians. And I think one of the reasons why is that there's just a lack of understanding of the power that God gives us through His Spirit. There are at least 87 names in the Bible of God's Spirit. And the work of the Spirit just spans the entire Bible. So go ahead and open here to Genesis 1, and the first time we see the Spirit is in verse 2. I mean, think about this. Even before God spoke the world into existence, the second verse of the Bible, we're introduced to His Spirit. The earth was formless and void, and darkness was over the surface of the deep. And the Spirit of God was moving. Some versions say hovering over the surface of the waters. Now that word moving or hovering, that's an interesting word in the Hebrew because it suggests a bird tenderly protecting her helpless baby birds in the nest, how she hovers over them. So that picture is the Spirit of God hovering over all the universe. And I think maybe the reason why is to display God's presence, God's power, God's protection. And I realize that there's a lot of mystery in this, but we can be sure of this. God's Spirit was there in the beginning, moving through the darkness, preparing the way for God to speak the world into existence and to bring light. So let me ask us this question. Do you think it's possible that the Holy Spirit still hovers and moves through the emptiness of life, the darkness, preparing the way for God to bring us out of the darkness into the light? You know, how much of God's providence is really the work of the Holy Spirit. We've talked about that before, but the conscience and what we call maybe luck or coincidence, are they really the work of the Spirit? Is the Spirit working in our conscience to bring us out of the darkness into light? Turn the page just a few chapters to Genesis chapter 6, verse 3. 6 verse 3. Then the Lord said, My spirit shall not strive with man forever, because he also is flesh. Nevertheless, his days shall be 120 years. I mean, in this context, the world was ripe for judgment because God saw evil just covering the earth. But even in this desperate situation, God's Spirit was at work. He was striving or contending, depending on your version. So, the question is, how does God's Spirit strive in us? And I think it goes back to, again, what we've studied in the past, maybe the promptings of our conscience. And what is he striving to accomplish? Very simply, to bring man back to God. I mean, from the very beginning, the Holy Spirit has always been striving to move us toward righteousness and truth. Remember, John 16 says that the Holy Spirit convicts us of sin. Now turn to Genesis chapter 41. Genesis chapter 41, verse 38. Then Pharaoh said to his servants, Can we find a man like this in whom is a divine spirit? And in the context here, Joseph is interpreting Pharaoh's dream. And as a pagan ruler, Pharaoh could hardly be expected to know about God's Spirit. Yet he recognized something different in Joseph's life. I mean, a power that he had the ability to interpret dreams. And I think a lesson here is when the Spirit is working in our lives, even unbelievers will know the difference. I mean, the world can tell that, you're a man of God. You're a woman of God. John talks about that in 1 John chapter 3, verse 10. Remember, he says the children of God and the children of Satan are obvious. And the difference is God's Spirit, or God's people have God's Spirit working within them, and His fruits come out. All right, now turn over to 1 Samuel chapter 16. 1 Samuel chapter 16, verse 13. It says this, Then Samuel took the horn of oil and anointed him in the midst of his brothers, and the Spirit of the Lord came mightily upon David from that day forward. And Samuel arose and went to Ramah. Now, the context, the Lord rejected Saul as king, a new ruler had to be found, and where should Samuel look? And the Lord directed him to the house of Jesse, and we know David was chosen. Now, oil is a familiar biblical symbol of the Spirit. I mean, the Old Testament priests and kings were anointed with oil as a means of setting them apart for special service to God. Also, oil was used as a fuel for lamps and for cleansing and for sanctifying. And I think a lesson here, just as priests and kings must be anointed with oil before their service can begin, so the power of the Holy Spirit is necessary for effective service for God. Just as oil is necessary for the lamp to give off light, so it is the Holy Spirit who gives us the power to shine as those lights of the world. And I mean, that's at least one of the reasons why we're given the gift of the Holy Spirit at baptism, to help us in our service and giving forth God's light to the world. All right, I want you to turn over now to the book of Nehemiah. Nehemiah. Let's see, let's go to chapter 9 and verse 20. Nehemiah 9, verse 20. It says, "You gave your good spirit to instruct them. Your manna did not withhold from their mouth, and you gave them water for their thirst." Verses 13 through 21 here kind of tells the story of God's faithfulness during the 40 years in the wilderness. And then you get to verse 20 and you see this, your good spirit that instructed Israel in the wilderness. And the lesson is God's spirit is good. He is God. Goodness is part of His character. I mean, He longs to produce, we know, the fruit of the Spirit in us, Galatians 5:22. And all He needs is a willing heart. He's the same Spirit today because His nature hasn't changed. He longs to produce in us that same goodness. All He needs is a willing heart, and the good Spirit of God will begin His gracious work in us. Now look over again to chapter 9 in Nehemiah, also verse 30. "However, you bore with them for many years, and admonished them by your Spirit through your prophets, yet they would not give ear. Therefore you gave them into the hand of the peoples of the land." And we know that this verse refers to all the prophets of Israel who faithfully warned the nation of coming judgment. And how did these men find the strength to carry on in a society that just constantly rejected God? And the answer is the Holy Spirit. He gave them and will give us the strength to do God's will in the face of opposition. The Spirit's job, one of the Spirit's job, we know, has always been to admonish and encourage God's people. Now let's look at a couple more verses for today, and then we'll stop. I'm just trying to go from 10 to 15 minutes on each of these lessons, so this may be, 6 weeks or so studying all these different names. But turn to Job 32. Job 32. Let me read 3 verses from the book of Job, make a few comments, and then we'll close for today. Job 32:8 says this, "But it is the spirit in man, and the breath," notice that the breath of the Almighty gives them understanding. Chapter 33, verse 4, "The Spirit of God has made me, and the breath of the Almighty gives me life." Maybe turn your page to chapter 34, verses 14 and 15. "If he should determine to do so, if he should gather to himself his spirit and his breath, all flesh would perish, and the man would return to dust." The Holy Spirit is the breath of the Almighty. And this stresses the sovereign power of the Spirit. I mean, Job 32 says He gives us understanding. Job 33 says He gives us life. Job 34 says, you know what, He can even take away life. So the Holy Spirit grants us life and breath at this very moment. And we're going to talk more about that when we get to Isaiah chapter 40. You know, we owe, let me just close with this for today. We owe our very lives to the Holy Spirit. He demonstrates His grace to us by granting us life and breath. We'll pick up next week. Encourage you to start looking through the Psalms, Psalm 51, Psalm 104, Psalm 139. Then we'll go from there at studying the names of the Holy Spirit. Hope you guys have a great week.